GM friends, and welcome to the Future of Gaming. You're listening to our weekly Future of Gaming podcasts. Today's discussion, we've brought a few known faces to the podcast. We have the usual Devin Becker, who's the gaming lead at NAMI. We have Tim Cotten, a very vehement participant of the FOGDAO Discord, who's the co-founder and CEO at Scripted. And then we have David Bennahum, who joined us a couple of weeks ago. He's co-founder and CEO at Ready Games, and we had a whole episode breaking down what Ready Games is up to. My name is Nico Vereecke. I host these things, also investor at Bitcraft. And today's discussion is around two new technologies that we've discussed amply separately, which is AI and Web3. And today we're bringing those two together. So the initial start of this wider conversation came when David basically pinged me and he's like, this is top of mind for me. He shared what he was thinking about, and I thought it warranted a conversation and an episode. So here we are. So David, why don't you take us away, walk us through your thinking, set the scene, and then we can dive in.
Well, first of all, thanks, Nico, for having me on. And Tim, great to meet you. And Devin, great to see you as well.
Absolutely.
I'm excited for this discussion because I think in the popular sort of conversation, obviously AI has taken center stage for good and for bad. And then, of course, some of us work in Web3, and we've been thinking a lot about like how these technologies, Web3 and AI, might actually be converging and working with each other. And here at Ready, we've developed a thesis. It did center initially around gaming, which is like where would AI and Web3 really interact? And at the core of it, I think we got to a couple of conclusions, and they really do relate to the core beliefs around, I think, blockchain and the notions of distributed computing, distributed ownership, which is so central to Web3. And I think this relates directly to AI in the following way, which is the challenge now with AI is it is highly, highly centralized. We are seeing so many services being financed and built that when you peel away the onion, really rely on three major large language models. I call them the big three. It's Facebook's, it's Google's, and it's Microsoft and OpenAI kind of munched together, right? That's the GPT product. And I'll just refer to them as the big three. Now, there's other large language models out there, but realistically, those big three are the supermajority of the entire AI universe right now. And so all of these services that are building on top of it are essentially creating huge amounts of value for those big three. And we can get later into, well, is there a defensible moat here? If you're using these big three large language models, can't anyone else essentially replicate whatever you're doing because the underlying IP doesn't even belong to you? These are more like investor questions that should be something that the people, putting capital into this, these are hard questions to answer. But I think even if you separate that investor hat question, there's a bigger society question, right? Which AI brings up, which is essentially, what are the ethics of this thing? What does it mean if so much data is ultimately owned by these big three? We've already had almost a decade of conversation and stress around social media and sort of the dominance of app stores and things like that. You've seen places like the European Union struggle mightily around these questions more than the United States, for example, in terms of how do we rein some of this in, especially because they're not European companies. And you see with AI kind of a magnification now of potentially this very dominant position by these big three. And so what do we do about that? And I think the answer, which might be, oh, well, let's stand up a competitor that's somehow going to be different. Well, you're building the same kind of model, an equity cap table. You're going to put a lot of money into that, and then you're just going to have a big four. And it's like, great, congratulations. And maybe out of the big four, one of the original big three will fall out, and now you're back to the big three. Round and round this little mulberry bush we went, but did we really solve the underlying problem of this consolidation of power and ownership? The answer is no. So this is a long-winded way of just setting the stage of what do we do with the ownership around AI models? And the answer, I think, begins to point a little bit to Web3. So what Web3 promises is that by the creation and use of a product, everyone contributing to it can become fractional owners into it, right? That's a very well understood component in Web3, that as you work and at Ready we know this too, like as we work to build sort of gaming infrastructure, the players in the community can become fractional owners in the project called Ready, for example. This actually aligns really, really interestingly with AI models, right? Where we are all being asked in a way to contribute to the creation of these large language models through our use of these products. Like we are doing that, but none of us are getting any fractional ownership for the contributions we're making. And the question then arises, if people were to start taking the existing large language model, like algorithmic methodologies, like those are understood, but then integrated them with a fractional ownership model, which is the blockchain Web3 innovation, would those models have a meaningful competitive advantage over the big three? Because people would understand that by contributing to them, building them, working towards them, they'd be, through the smart contracts and other methods, a way for them to get ownership into the project, which means maybe the quality of those models would actually be greater over time than the more centralized models, because we'd all have both economic and philosophical incentives to work with the more open model. So that's like one really big sort of AI question right there. That is there, from a business logic standpoint, a more valuable path using Web3 as a cooperative method to truly, at scale, across tens of millions of contributors, possibly more, create this type of ownership model? And would that, in a way, begin to solve the centralization question? Because now we'd have something that would be more cooperative. We could all plug into it, all use it, and by the way, pay for it in some way that then distributed those dividends or rewards to everyone who contributed to it. So it's such a sort of DAO Web3 way of approaching it. So that's just the first giant chunk. And then there's a second giant chunk. If that one wasn't big enough, I'll give you the other big chunk, which is this whole notion of autonomous agents. And Tim, you've been working on this kind of idea, and you'll talk about it. I'm really excited to hear what you're doing with game design and autonomous agents. But this idea of autonomous agents goes back at least 30 years, maybe even more. It's one of the original foundational ideas in AI. When they were first really thought about, and this goes back to the early 90s, they were called intelligent agents. There was even a company called General Magic that raised $400 million to build intelligent agents. It came out of the MIT Media Lab. Patty Mays, the professor, is still there. She was a pioneer in thinking of this stuff. It was a completely centralized network. It was so centralized, it even predated the internet. It had its own internet it was going to build, and its own PDAs like iPhones connected to it. And the whole thing was this massive problem it had to solve. But underneath it was this idea of these autonomous intelligent agents that had legal authority to take actions on behalf of their owners, whether those are companies or people. And they had all kinds of ideas like, hey, these agents could go out and like negotiate airline tickets for you, or band together into a buying pool and collectively make a purchase decision, and you'd all get a deep discount because you got like 1 million agents to agree to buy something together. The problem with this stuff is it was completely centralized, and it required so much kind of delegation of authority to a single corporation that, of course, nobody wanted to play nice with this. It's the same problem with the big three, right? We're just seeing this back then. Everyone was like, yee, wait a minute, I'm giving all this to somebody. Now, flash forward to 2023. Well, the notion of a smart contract, this ability to do trustless transactions across a network with smart contracts, wrapping intelligent agents into smart contracts, and now giving them the legal autonomy to really go out and negotiate based on that smart contract with other agents is a potentially revolutionary breakthrough. That is a Web3 technology that, when fused together with the agent model, could finally unlock this deep vision that goes back 30 years or more and allow it to be decentralized, distributed, and really, really scale without any one person owning this technology, which, by the way, would make it far more likely to be massively adopted, the way nobody owned the underlying protocols for the internet, like TCP/IP and other things, which themselves are, in a way, earlier versions of this kind of decentralized network, right? The notion of packet switching, things like that. This is all of a kind. And so we see ourselves on this threshold right now where AI can go in one of two ways: massively centralized, with a few companies owning all the data, everything we do, huge amounts of economic upside. If they're multi-trillion-dollar companies today, they're multi-trillion-dollar companies in the future. Kind of terrifying. Or we just sort of really focus in on how do we break this up to be decentralized and distributed through the force of will of people self-organizing to do this, knowing all the technology is there. We actually have all the ingredients. It is there today. That's what's so awesome about it. The execution risk on this is pretty low from a technical standpoint. I don't want to dismiss it as like trivial, but it's doable. The issue is more the social capital. Are we willing to really band together and do this? What are the incentives? How would this be organized? But I just want to put out there as a kind of mission statement. Like, why can't we just go ahead, decentralize all of these AI large language models, all become fractional owners, whether it's through intelligent agents, the building of these models, and essentially live in a world where we don't find ourselves in a 10x worse situation with a handful of monopolies controlling even more GDP, even more global economic output, just because we didn't even bother trying to do this. So thank you all. I've set the stage. Let's discuss.
Wow, that was something amazing. Appreciate that, David.
Wow.
A bunch to unpack there. You know what? Instead of trying to summarize it, there's too much to summarize. I'll. So, Devin, Tim, who of you, on a scale to 1 to 10, how hard, do you want to respond to this? Or be the first to respond? I see both of you almost exploding.
Yeah,
Devin,
I
I'll let you go
push
first.
back super hard, but that way Tim can respond in a positive way.
Let's have Devin start. I agree. I'll give the hopium.
I'm super bullish on all this stuff because I'm just a tech futurist at heart. But at the same time, there's a lot of problems with this, that need to be solved. And if you look back at the history of a lot of technology, fundamentally, this idea generally doesn't work only because of the forces of capitalism
Devin,
and stuff.
when you say this idea,
Yeah,
there was a lot
decentralization
said,
of AI, right? Let me focus on that part first. Yeah. So when it comes to decentralizing the AI stuff, right, and making it this big, sort of decentralized project, if you look at one of the best examples of us trying to do something like that, the internet, right? It started out in a lot of great ways. It was pretty, centralized at first around colleges, and then decentralized, and then re-centralized as people became the ISPs became a couple different companies, a lot of different choke points. Domains are controlled by a certain number of companies and organizations. So there's it becomes consolidated at some point, right? Whether that be a bunch of organizations or one, right? Obviously, we want to avoid the one situation. And I think generally you will, for the most part, at least have two kind of things. And the other thing with that is we want to talk about, ownership and contribution and stuff. And it's kind of funny that if you look about it, most industries tended to be built originally around piracy. So the internet itself was built up around piracy to an extent. Hollywood was built around piracy of foreign movies. We tend to build up these industries through that piracy, and AI is no exception, right? This idea of all the stuff that was contributed to Bootstrap, that was essentially pirated into it. And so I think, there'll always be that kind of phase where tons of stuff is being put into it that no one really owns or controls or is marked as this, I deserve some sort of attribution for this. And then down the road, maybe we have some sort of ways of handling that, right? Now we have content creators on the internet and people getting attribution for stuff, but theft still happens readily. And I'm sure what David's trying to say about the blockchain helping with attribution and tracking stuff. There's definitely stuff that can work there in terms of the public ledger and the blockchain. But I think there's a certain amount of human ingenuity that'll work around a lot of technological answers to try and enforce this stuff. That I would love to say it would work, but it's a little problematic. And also this idea of having a lot of this stuff work with autonomous agents is great, but we have a couple of problems to solve around that when it comes to bad actors as well, which is we're talking about all this autonomous stuff, and the blockchain is not known for having reversibility. So if things happen on the blockchain that you were not intending for them to happen, in human situations, most of the time you can undo stuff, right? You can get people to fix something or whatever we have to deal with. If you go to the grocery store and use those self-checkouts, about 50% of the time or more, you're going to have to deal with a human still, right? Because some kind of problem with the machine, you have to have a human there to kind of sort it out. And we haven't gotten past that point, regardless of large language models or not. We're still not really to the point. And then you start to put immutability on that with the blockchain. That could become really problematic really fast because of people's ability to attack it. And you see these huge irreversible theft attacks, right, that happen, the Axie Bridge or all these other ones where we're not going to have another situation where we fork the entire blockchain like Ethereum, right? So that sort of irreversibility is going to have to be accounted for in these ideas of autonomous agents where, we have these sorts of breaks or things that we could do to kind of reverse things or undo actions. And then what happens when these sorts of things are taken over by bad actors? We talk about things like identity and cryptography for these things, but I come from also doing red team cybersecurity. And one of the things you learn very quickly, especially Windows environments, is it's very easy to mimic people's identity and then piggyback off that from identity to identity to identity. And it doesn't matter whether or not there's authorization or passwords or two-factor, there's ways to get over those things. And then now you are being treated as that person. And when we decentralize identity, that becomes even more problematic, right? Because we're counting on the machines to enforce that, whether that be through essentially public key encryption that we're using with the blockchain, or whatever other two-factor method, or even facial recognition. All that stuff has flaws. So we just need to keep all that stuff in mind, that like all this can be hijacked and used against us. And unfortunately, the governments, for example, would tend to do that. And they've proven they'll do that. And I'm saying the government's plural because I'm not picking on any one particular government, because most of them tend to do that, whether they're dictators or U.S. government, for example, tends to just set up all these backdoors, tends to control these things, even if we think we're decentralized and controlling it. Look at Tor, enter and exit nodes pretty much controlled to an extent by government, NSA and stuff like that. So as much as I would love for all this to work, we got to be like cognizant of a lot of these problems, I think. And I don't want to go too far down any of these rabbit holes, but that like is my immediate thoughts on that stuff.
I'm going to hold off on responding and let Tim maybe say what he wants to say.
Wow. So I feel like a man who brought a mace to a sword fight of words, right? I'm not going to have the elegance and eloquence to like necessarily reach everything that David was talking about in his initial introduction. But I want to start with just kind of some of what Devin's saying. I'm trying to think about the primary reasons you would use a blockchain in any relationship with AI, right? And I think what David is pointing out is reputation is one of the biggest parts, right? If we have autonomous agents executing code, writing things, publishing things, if we have these autonomous agents representing a virtual digital twin, right? And that's really what we're talking about here, digital twinning like Tim. It needs to be bound to my own identity, and then it needs to be marked as an AI aspect of my identity in a perfect world, right? Now, there is a framework that the World Wide Web Consortium has put together for this. This is a public standard called the Decentralized Identity document, right? And it's run by the Decentralized Identity Foundation. There is a method for publishing these kinds of reputational proofs and setting up identity in a decentralized format, whether you're on a blockchain or off. So then we ask, okay, if such a chain came to exist that handled these reputations, that's great. What else is the blockchain for AI for? And I can think of a couple of things. If I'm practical thinking, not all of us have 16 gig video cards, right? Not all of us have access to the ability to execute these large language models or diffusion models for image generation. In that case, is it worth creating a massively distributed computational system that can be used for both training models and then, as David is suggesting, have fractional ownership based on how much you're contributing to the overall network? That's a great use for a blockchain system as far as like proving that you participated and proving what the value of your participation was. Do we extend that so that you can call that distributed network for doing on-the-fly stuff, such as image generation? Hey, I don't want to go to Google Colab, or I don't want to go to my own model that I'm having to host on my own hardware. Can I just call something from a blockchain and do it and then get results? And the use case for that, right, is either pseudo-anonymity or just privacy of your own stuff. Say you could host your own model ephemerally. And if we I don't believe this exists yet, because I don't believe we in any way generate diffusion models that have encryption already embedded in them, right? So if there's an application for future homomorphic encryption in it, wow, that would be an interesting field to study, right? So I see like all this cool potential. So I kind of put it back to what Devin's saying, people bias towards convenience. Right? That's why Web 2 exists, because no one really wanted to host their own email servers, right? We all love the Gmails and the Hotmails of the world. So what does that look like for this fusion, this proposed fusion of Web 3, which is already really hard for people to get involved with, and AI? Until companies are creating like technology that I can just spin up and the AI looks like the movie Her and just says, hey, by the way, I need your permission and then I'm going to go do all this stuff for you. Well, a lot of this is going to be command line stuff and sitting there and being hackers. And that's not accessible to everyone yet. So admittedly, I'm working on that, right? I adopted Yohei Nakajima's Baby AGI framework, that entire methodology. I've been pushing stuff out because it is amazing how we can synthesize the last 30 or 40 years of AI, right? All the systemic formal logic of structured AI with deep learning being the translation layer for all the loose human data. And because that's the only thing that was ever stopping the works of the early intelligence agents that David's talking about. Like, I'm connected here with, I have a residency for my company at George Mason University. The head of the Learning Agent Center of the AI area is Dr. Takeuch, and he wrote the book on building intelligent agents, right? So these are people who see what deep learning can do to take human loose text and information and then turn that into the language of structurism that they can use for their formal AI logic. And there's a great fusion area there, which is what Yohei figured out, right? That Baby AGI stuff is all about structuring like the feedback loops. So I'll stop there for a second.
Yeah.
So just to interject for a little bit, we went a bunch of different ways, and I'd like to center, our focus for this episode, and then perhaps we can touch on some of the other discussions later. Obviously, if you agreed with my choice, David, Devin, you pointed out that there are a bunch of technical and maybe even economical complexities with having autonomous agents help us in our daily lives, and there's some security issues there. What I would like to do is skip that discussion for the time being and just assume we live in a world where that is technically feasible, so we can focus on, I think, we might get to some interesting insights around the decentralization of AI models, because that's something that I haven't spent too much time thinking about myself. If everyone agrees, David, if you agree, you can perhaps give maybe a little bit rebuttal or your thoughts on the points raised just now.
I would say we should also make sure we're if we're talking about AI models, we're like delineate if we're talking about LLMs or some other thing, just because like that's not the only AI model, right? And I think it gets kind of pigeonholed into that especially when you're talking about like these three companies controlling everything. Well, it's like, for that particular tech.
Wait, so there are not only 3 AIs in the world that are LLMs that are... No? Shit.
No.
Yeah.
Just visit Hugging Face.
Yeah, exactly. So, Nico, just to recap, I think your question is, if you could just recap the question that you're looking for here, because
honestly, like, I didn't really ask a question. I said, we've heard you've laid out your thought process. You set the scene. We got some rebuttal from Devin, who I believe said initially that a lot of the internet is already built on privacy, where there's actually no concern for who owns what. And to my mind, one of the cases you were making is we should all own the models, the AI that were trained in the end on what we provided to the internet. So
yeah, it's a philosophical, I mean, it really is a philosophical question here about social engineering. Like, what do we want here? I mean, is this a common utility that we can all be using, or is it really owned by, again, a small handful of companies? I think we can agree that's really troubling for a small handful of companies to own all this, especially because it's entering a kind of escape velocity now where more kind of begins to generate more logarithmically. And so the gap there can potentially get larger and larger. So it's a bit of an urgent question, right? Because if these things are left untouched, at some point, they just move so far out there that it may be harder and harder to compete with them in any other structure. I think the incentive to create a method for us to get in there and start generating data that we collectively are responsible for is very high. Like, everyone is extremely sensitized to what we're talking about. I think there's social alignment, not just on an individual basis, but on a collective basis. I think we're all extremely educated now at why this is worrisome. The whole notion that we are the product at Facebook is like a conventional wisdom now, that like, oh, you do all this stuff on the Facebook or the Meta platform writ large, and in exchange for that, they kind of quote unquote give you this product for free, and then they make something like $80 to $400 a year off of you, depending on your psychographic and demographic profile, which is essentially what happens. So we know that that's become a problem at this point. It creates all kinds of external costs, externalities that we don't like. And this AI thing is just that times 10 potentially in terms of the external costs. They're really, really there. And so the question becomes, we know the frameworks on how to potentially create a decentralized ownership model, right? Those have been developed over the last 10 years in the Web3 context. They show up as DAOs and other things. What would it mean to begin to generate something like that with the express purpose of creating a foundation for the development of these models, whether they're LLMs or other models, where we know that computationally they benefit by being shared, right? Because it's the myriad contributions from different sources that, in a sense, elevate the ability of that model to be more performant, right? The more sort of touch points come into it, the more it's literally going to evolve or learn in a more performant manner. So the volume of engagement is very much related to the, I would say, the accuracy or the value of the model over time. And so can we create incentives through this ownership model for people to opt into contributing to that model versus some other model? And I'll also say there's so many actors here that would be aligned with this, because remember, everyone who isn't one of those big three would be aligned with this, which is like, wow, that's a lot of different actors. You even get down to civil society, like governments would be aligned with this. And I know we often are like, boo, boo, governments, whatever. But sometimes they actually can do really valuable things. Like they can actually help with some of the powering of these models. Remember, I live in Canada, for instance, where I am in Montreal, we have some of the largest reserves of green energy in the world. Like we have massive amounts of hydropower just spilling out of here, so much that we have surplus. Like it's just a god-awful, massive quantity. Well, in the context of this type of model we're talking about of collective ownership, people could, literally governments might say, I'm going to donate electricity time to some of this processing. I have all this hydro. It's totally green. It aligns with my civic values. I don't want these big three. There aren't even Canadian companies like dominating this market. Why not donate some quantity of power, to allow these things to happen? No one's going to donate to the big three to do that. So there's all kinds of interesting alliances that can be built if this thing is designed well, where it begins to get competitive advantages that go beyond just, people would like to use this model better. You can also subsidize it, essentially. You can do things because it has an alignment with other people's interests. People can donate more than their time, more than their money. They can essentially donate things like energy as well, which is vitally important. When you think about the cost of running these data centers, people often talk about, the other issue is, it costs millions of dollars a day to run maybe something like ChatGPT. I have no idea what it really costs a day. I don't know if anybody really knows, but it seems reasonable to guess that. Well, what if all of a sudden through these types of in-kind donations from other entities that believe in the value of this, that cost gets subsidized massively? Then how does that private company compete with that? They might complain to high holy hell that it's not fair, but you know what? It isn't fair. We've made a decision to value something above and beyond. So I think there's just a lot of opportunity here to craft this strategically. And if it's done well, then you kind of turn it on, right? And it begins to operate. I think there's so much talent in the AI field that probably would align with helping do this, because in fact, they see that this is unsustainable. They don't want to all work for one of these big companies. They would prefer to somehow donate their knowledge and time to something more cooperative. So I really think this part is quite reachable. It just requires the conviction of probably like a couple hundred people to begin with that know what they're doing. And then from there, you ring it with a few thousand, and then you're off to the races. It can move very, very quickly. In fact, we could come up with it right here, right now, today. This is one of the first conversations about it that I know about. So why not think about it? Why not just think big and be like, hey, we could do this. Like the four of us sitting right here could start to initiate something like this if we wanted to. Why not? If not us, who? And if not now, when? This seems like it's a pretty pressing issue.
Yeah, just really quick, I think to be more proactive and not devil's advocate on this one, the central problem I think with that's solvable is not to even centralize that to where we're like everyone contributes to this one big open source one. It's to fragment it on purpose, to say this is an open source thing that anyone can fragment and do their own. Because if you centralize it into one particular, like everyone's contributing this one, politics take over very quickly, and then that becomes its own entrenched problem, right? So blockchains themselves, right? Like if Bitcoin was the only one allowed to exist, we wouldn't have Ethereum, we wouldn't have all these others, we wouldn't have the layer 2s. And so it's more like that, right? If we're using blockchain as a model, let's use blockchain as a model, and same idea, right? Let people start their own things and let it be like evolutionary competition to an extent, because we actually probably need more than one model. It'll probably turn out that like this LLM's good at this or this one's good at this, and having the competition I think will be very valuable. And so it's like, let's just make sure the technology is accessible for these sorts of groups to form, and then let them form and then help them form, rather than trying to organize one big one, I think.
So would you see that, I agree with you, Devin, would you see that as like a layer 3, not to get too geeky on layers here with blockchain, but a kind of an application layer that would be open for the purpose of making it easier to operate these models on the lower level elements of the blockchain, the layer 2, layer 1, right? Which is the part you don't want to necessarily have to deal with because that becomes very technically fussy. So you have this sort of abstraction layer, I'll just call it the layer 3, which is designed to allow like 1,000 models to flourish. And so we just solved that part, right? And then what goes on top of that is whatever goes on top of that. So that's one way to think about it. It's just kind of like this open source layer 3.
Though, because there's the technology component in terms of like how the model actually works, the algorithms, all that stuff. And then there's the data side, which is like the actual model and the training of that model. And so it's like we kind of need both of those things to be accessible for that fragmentation to be like successful. So people can't just go. I mean, obviously, I'm not expecting or like thinking that OpenAI should completely open source their entire GPT-4 model, right? Like that probably doesn't make commercial sense for them to do that. But, like if there's some other, even if it be a government run thing, whatever it is, enough building up that training of that model that does it in a public way that people can learn how to train their own models. Maybe we get some micro models. Maybe people combine those into bigger models. Like eventually this idea of like helping people bootstrap that up so that one company doesn't control like the model, and that we have, because you're talking about like if we're contributing data to the model, then we should have some ownership of that model. Well, then we need to also like make sure that training method or that method of taking our data is also like an accessible thing. So if you're talking about it as like a layer 3, we also need to make sure that like the data that attaches to is accessible and the methodology or the algorithm is accessible. And I think if you open source that stuff out, it makes sure that like people can't just take it over, I think.
Yeah. And I do think that gaming poses a really interesting like vertical for some of this early adoption here around AI, because as Tim, AI and gaming, they just go together like peanut butter and jelly. There's something there that's really, really strong. half from the beginning.
Yeah.
But also gaming is kind of safe in a way. Like it's different than say Wall Street, where you're like, dude, you don't want that to go wrong in a Wall Street context. To Devin's point, like you don't want people breaking in there and doing stuff. But gaming, it's like it's a little safer. It's not without some potential risk, but it seems like a juicy place to begin with some of this thinking.
Yeah, and there's a maxim I go by when I do game design, and that is, all games are simulations, but not all simulations are games, right? And that means when you're building large virtual systems, you have to account for good actors, bad actors, and all the above. I'm struck by what you guys are talking about with, hey, we could invent it right here. Whether it's the allocation of the distributed resources to generate stuff, and to Nico's point, which models we're talking about, whether we're talking about diffusions or LLMs, that's kind of less important as much as how you would do attribution as these models evolve. That's a big open question, and let me give you an example. Chris McKinstry back in 2005 ran the MindPixel project, and if you've never heard of it, this was pre-blockchain and pre-deep learning, or at least early deep learning. It was before it was used for deep learning applications. It was a project that just crowdsourced humans to answer simple binary questions, such as, is the sky blue? And, 1,000 people would answer, and the answer would be on a scale of 0 to 1, and it'd be about 0.9 because, sometimes it's not blue. Right. And when you put those facts together, he felt that he could use it as a training validation set for future AIs. Unfortunately, he passed away and the project fell into disuse. But he had promised his users that they would find a way to monetize it so that everyone who contributed would have a fractional piece of ownership pre-blockchain.
Interesting. Wow.
And then, of course, now we're here saying, hey, we want to do the same thing that Chris figured out, right? We want to do things like that. Well, blockchain, of course, is a natural solution for fractionalized ownership, right? But then let's take the diffusion models. Let's look at like something that you're building checkpoints, like with automatic 1111. And here's what's interesting about image generation and generative adversarial networks, like the stable diffusion models. All these people who are making models right now, publishing them on Civet AI, putting them on Hugging Face, right? If you look at the metadata, you can see the hashes of all the other checkpoints that they merged with or trained on or did weighted sum averages. Whatever they did to create their model, whatever they added to train it, you've got hashes of. But you can strip that metadata out. And there's no public signing certificate or anything for the proof of attribution. That doesn't exist right now in those models. Now we innovate that. We put that into that stream that we're talking about, having this kind of system. Suddenly, there's value. I think that there's a conversation to be had on a technical and a production level.
Yes, because at the end of the day, what the blockchain is doing is it's cryptographically signing every write operation and potentially every read operation, but certainly every write operation on this decentralized database. So every time you do a write operation and you sign it, you have a verifiable history of the provenance of that, how that data evolved, which is the thing that unlocks attribution, and it's the thing that unlocks the distributed ownership, and it's cryptographically secure, meaning you can't actually spoof that signature. You can maybe hijack the entity that did it. That's a different issue, but nonetheless, the signature is valid.
It's the immutable history, right? That makes
sure immutable
like
history.
People get attribution.
Exactly, and so I think that is a seriously explosive innovation when combined with, as you're pointing out, Tim, like the creation of the data behind these models. It's super juicy, and that's what allows for, I think, also code audits where, like, where is an AI misbehaving? Where is it sort of deviating? We haven't really talked about this, but these AIs right now have no accountability at all.
Yeah.
But in a signed environment, they do have accountability, and you can essentially audit them. You can look through the history, and if they go south somewhere, you know, you can potentially shut them down. You can flag them as basically toxic. Like, we're not going to let them run, you know, in our area, in our cloud compute, et cetera.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up because you've touched on it so well, and I just want to really hone in on this.
Yeah.
That attribution layer of generated, well, whatever was used to train the model is critically important. My company did customer discovery with 24 of like the biggest game developers on the planet, talking about our generative / autonomous workflow systems. And one of the biggest questions is, how can we use these cool models when we don't know what images were trained them and we have copyright, we have legal concerns about them? You saw probably in the news that Steam prevented one game from coming onto the platform because they couldn't prove where their AI generated images sources came from, right? And so there's a difference between that, between a human and an AI generating games. And people are going, if we can have the chain of proof, suddenly those issues start to go away. Right? As long as that proof is either open systems and it's not using other people's intellectual property. But if the chains of proof in the generative AI, whether it's LLMs or whether it's, you know, diffusion models, if we can do that, there's value.
And I'll even go further and say, Tim, there's also sort of a market effect here, where if it turns out there's value in signing all this data because it helps enforce intellectual property, because it helps enforce the quality of the language model and accountability, then you get into the situation where you still need cloud compute services and environments to run these things. These are businesses. A lot of them are Web2 businesses, frankly. And they could then begin to have a standard where, like, if your proposed, you know, algorithmic method you want to run on my service doesn't conform to these kind of signed et ceteras, I'm not going to run it. I'm just not going to do it because I don't want the risk factor of this thing having an escape or doing something bad. And so suddenly, there's this sort of industry convention that starts to emerge that you should code sign, as it were, all your AIs. Your methods should be code signed. Code signing has been going on for 30 years. It's why on a Windows PC, when you install an app from a website, it says, "Do you want to install this thing from XYZ publisher?"
Yeah.
And it doesn't say it's dangerous, it might kill your computer, because it knows it's code signed. And then when you try to install something that's not code signed on your PC, you'll get the frightening little warnings like, "I don't know what this is. It could be bad." And the answer is, it's just not code signed, dude. The person didn't spend $500 with GoDaddy or whoever to sign their thing. So I think these models, by getting the signing property, then it's really hard for, you know, immediately people like the big cloud compute services, which happen to correspond with the big 3 AI companies, by the way, would probably start saying, well, we're not going to run on our cloud compute instance, you know, AI bundles that aren't code signed, because we don't want to deal with the liability of being that cloud service that had this awful thing escape. And then you've got this sort of selection where who's going to want to do that? Well, then these weird third-party services might agree to do it, but then they're all like skeevy, and then they have problems probably eventually opening bank accounts, getting insurance for the director and officers of the company, because it's like, yuck, you know, they're full of liability. So this opens up that dimension, I guess, is what I'm saying here. Of
I love your forward-lookingness on that. Yeah, no, totally forward-looking, because we've already seen the evolution of like the old checkpoint format to safe tensors to prevent code execution, right?
Yes.
You're absolutely right that soon we'll probably see people signing the models or coming up with a standard, and hey, we can be a part of that. We can start making these requirements, because if we're going to have any kind of distributed platform where we're having people host models and then be able to execute them, there's a reputational and a security set of risks associated with that, and it's a very natural conversation to have. Fair enough.
Yeah, the AIs themselves all have a reputation at that point and a history.
I get worried about who's controlling that code citing or that reputation, because if you look at the way Apple's kind of maliciously used code citing, like they're like doing it for safety, but then also maliciously using it to control applications getting onto their platform, both for good and bad. And then you have stuff like domains, for example, right? Like domains and certificates that gets abused by governments, especially the US, to pull websites down and things like that. So as soon as we start creating some of those control points that are really useful, they also are abusable by those that have access, right? Because we have to trust someone to manage a lot of that stuff. Now, at least we have like the decentralized aspects of the blockchains and that kind of signing. So I think we just have to make sure to keep that in mind, that like we are doing it via code rather than via like control systems that like someone is just an authority of.
Code and reputation. I think that's the key thing that David's been talking about from the beginning here, is that there needs to be a reputational identity system, which there are standards for. We just have not adopted as an industry.
Social credit, like we just gotta worry, like make sure we don't drift into Chinese social credit systems.
I mean,
I'm thinking more like let's encrypt, TLS certificate standards, not social credits from the CCCP.
The only problem which you guys kind of hinted at, like, is like with the stuff with certificates, right? What happens is like everyone got trained to see that padlock, right? And like, well, you need to make sure the website's secure with that padlock. Well, I mean, it turns out realistically, 99% of the time, the padlock or the HTTPS wasn't really a problem. Most people aren't man in the middle attacking your website traffic. It was really like the phishing sites and stuff like that. So like people got trained to see that as a false signal of like this is safe. And I think we just have to also be cautious to make sure that people like if they're trained off these signings, that they know what like for example when in blockchain stuff, right, when people start taking over websites and doing phishing sites to get people to like, oh, it's a free mint, and then like say Yuga Labs' Instagram or Twitter will get taken over and they're a trusted authority for this information. We just got to make sure we have like good backup systems, I think, for this stuff to find ways, like, because the more we decentralize, the harder it is for us to verify things in a way that isn't mechanical. In some way, right? Like, which is good and bad, right? Like, the mechanical stuff is actually really great, but we have to have like non-mechanical fallbacks, I think. Or again, it's the situation of the checkout at the grocery store where there's no human to fix the problem, and so like again, that starts to go back towards authority. So like we just have to really smartly approach that fallback area to make sure that doesn't just turn into a backdoor for authority to control.
I mean, there's this adage: "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." And I think we can get into these rabbit holes where you want perfection, and then until you get perfection, you're like, well, we shouldn't really do anything. But then the alternative is by not doing anything, there's a lot of other bigger problems that emerge.
There's some structurally ways to think about this, like smartly, like ahead of time, to look at the problems of the past and be like, oh, we can actually design around this. Like I said about the fallback and like making sure that just as long as you're like, oh, hey, I know that if I give authority to like say a government, we know how they use like domain names and so like we just make sure we don't do that. For these problems.
And I think a lot of this doesn't require legislation or any kind of oversight. It's just social conventions using code and signing to just create attribution. All we're doing here is creating attribution.
Yeah, exactly.
And I also kind of wonder, once you have granular attribution on a blockchain related to these AI processes, then interestingly, the machine learning on that attribution is such that you could probably have entities that are pretty good at detecting where something is suddenly veering off track from its historical attribution. Like very, very quickly, you could have kind of early warning systems where it's like, geez, the behavior on this thing seems to have really shifted from being like super trusted to super not. Probably it's been taken over. And so we're just going to red flag this as like warning, like this looks weird. At which point humans can just look at it and be like, it is weird. Looks like about 90 minutes ago, it started behaving really differently. Let's just put it on a suspicious list, opt in, until we sort out it goes into a container or something until it's sorted out. And then, it turns out, something bad happened. There was a takeover.
Smart.
That's also a good place for autonomous AI to be helping with that.
Exactly.
AI babysitting AI.
I have practical questions. I'll let you guys do your thing for a while, but now I want to push back. By the way, just to talk about the perfect and the good, it was just funny to have like a games founder talk to an ex-cybersecurity person, which is the good is good enough, and then the it needs to be perfect, because I work in cybersecurity and I can get my ass fired. So that was interesting. Just to take just one brief step back, I feel like we're having two separate discussions. Well, kind of related, but one is about building more decentralized model and a decentralized AI, and then two is essentially starting to sign pretty much everything we do online. One question, I guess, which is related to both is, how does this work with the current data that already exists, right? How do you retroactively make this work in an efficient way? Because the amount of data that exists today is huge. That being said, the amount of data that gets created every day is only increasing. So, if there's a cutoff point from which point you start actually signing everything and correctly, hypothetically, attributing everything, it's going to take a while to catch up in terms of the amount of data that's there. David, I'm sure you've thought about this.
Yeah. Look, I think it's easier to just start going forward wanting to do something. Like you're like, we're just going to go forward and do it. And so we're doing it this way. We're doing attribution. We've decided to sign certain data events, et cetera. So you do that. And then once you establish that functionally, it's going to have a shakedown cruise. There'll be a lot of glitches and issues. And when you get to a point where it seems to be scaling and working, then actually, I think you can have a side project where you might want to go back in time and ask yourself, knowing the best practice of how we do it currently, let's go back in time now and possibly sign a bunch of stuff that was done before we were able to do this. But let's not munge the two together. Let's first just get it right going forward. And then I think going back is a project that could be done. And the scope of it, scale of it, how to do it, will be infinitely more clear by having gone forward and just done this correctly to begin with, without any legacy, technical debt, so to speak, or anything else you're trying to deal with.
And I think it's safe to say that, naively hashing all the old stuff is not the solution, because, you train one more image on a checkpoint, the hash is completely different. So there must be other systems that we come up with.
I just think about attribution right now of even quotes, right? Where people misquote famous historic figures. Attribution that's well documented, we still can't even get right because there's no code enforcing that.
And I'll point out that the onset of it's interesting, the sort of idea of the deep fake, which I think we've all heard about this now for 18 months. It's been like a thing, like this word deep fake. But at the same time, we haven't really seen it at scale. I don't know if anyone on this call is like, oh my God.
We haven't
we're
detected it yet, yeah.
Or maybe we have, but kind of wonder when this thing is going to really, really erupt, into a real problem. And then you go back to attribution, where it's like, well, there is no attribution on social networks, really. I mean, your handle on Instagram or on Twitter is just like whatever. You just made that account, right? There's no accountability or attribution to that. So that's where these deepfakes often come from. It's a relatively new account with no authenticity to it. Now, all of a sudden, with this attribution model, you could put a deepfake out there. No, you're not going to stop that technology. You'll be able to create a perfect version of me on a podcast saying really stuff that I'll be so deeply embarrassed about I'll want to hide under a rock. But if the attribution doesn't make sense, everybody can cackle and say, well, obviously, it didn't come from anything attributed to David. That's an interesting question, how deepfakes may drive the demand for attribution as well by everyday people, because it's at some point, if it really does start to touch everybody, just imagine kids for a minute, like teenagers being able to do deep fakes around each other, so every little quarrel happens in the life of a 14-year-old can start manifesting in some super scary deep fake thing, which is just a mess.
Photoshopped for a long time.
We've got
but
we're talking Black Mirror territory here.
Yes, exactly. It is Black Mirror territory.
Yeah,
correct. Let's just assume TikTok videos that are so oh my God, they actually So at that point, attribution, every mom and dad is going to be like, I want attribution too, because I can't deal with the fact that my children are affected by this now deepfake reality. This hasn't happened yet, to be fair. I haven't seen it at that scale. But if it does happen, and I hope it wouldn't, but it's hard to believe it won't.
It'll happen at the government level first, probably, when it comes to trying to incite war or that sort of spycraft kind of stuff where that's
happening.
It probably already does. And I think it was the CIA or one of those organizations in the U.S. specifically said they wanted to do deepfake stuff for that kind of purposes. And so
right.
I think we might see it there, but not know we're seeing it there first.
I'll just say that when it shows up in 8th grade, it's going to be a different level of concern than when it's showing up at some abstract battlefield concept. 8th grade kids doing deep fakes at scale to each other around every little thing that bothers them. Attribution and accountability, it's it'll literally be fix this in 2 days. And the pressure on Meta, the pressure on these companies will be so demented at that point, because you'll have literally millions of parents just flipping out. Apple, by the way, might just literally ban those apps off the phone, because at the end of the day, what's the vector? It's the iPhone. And they might just say, you know what, until Meta fixes this, Twitter, Facebook, Insta, you're off the App Store because you're not guaranteeing your terms of service anymore. Boom. And then they have, can you imagine what that would do to their stock price? It would just crater by 30, 40% in 24 hours. So all of a sudden, cryptographic attribution could show up wildly fast, because they're like, dude, if we don't do this right now, like we're not getting back on iPhone or whatever. So, I mean, these are just extreme, like out there ideas, but are they that extreme? Because remember, again, what it's like to have 10 million parents flipping out at scale in the United States. Like, you do not want to be on their side of that. Like, you're done, you're toast. Like, that thing gets solved in literally days, like way fast. So deepfakes are kind of, I think, an interesting pressure point for common people, as it were, like non-techie nerds, to say, oh, shoot, how do I know this is a deepfake? And the answer is attribution. Like,
well, it's funny we use the word term deep fake instead of forgery. It's like I actually had programs when I was in high school that would print out fake report cards for me. Like I had ones that were like fake movie tickets. Like so, like was I doing deep fakes in high school? Like the dot
that explains so much. By the way,
it does really.
I know.
Now
that's why he got where he is today.
Right, but I just feel like there's that idea of like that kind of stuff. Like I could forge my teacher's signature if I wanted. Like was that a deep fake of my teacher? Like and so this is more just like multimedia forgery is essentially what we're talking about. We're just using a new term for it.
So here's something, Devin, you mentioned that, like people have been getting quotes and attribution wrong for so long. But what have we been seeing that perfectly goes in with what David's talking about? Go to Reddit. If you make a grammar mistake or you call Ukraine the Ukraine, you're most likely to get a bot that attaches to your comment and instantly says, hey, by the way, just so you know, here's the reasons why you don't want to do that. And those self-correcting bots that are like infecting social media platforms, right, are just a sign of how we're going to start. It's a sign of like that attribution issue you're talking about. That's just going to cycle into deep fake detection. It's going to cycle into, hey, this content doesn't look like it came from you, right? So we already see that the prototypes of these models exist. They're just being used for like simple trivial things right now.
And they're not interoperable, and they don't really scale in a meaningful way. They're ad hoc. So this allows for interoperability and scale.
Yeah. I think alongside these problems, though, we also need to, like, not in this conversation, but like in general, identity is like a huge part of solving this, because if you can't protect identity, then identities just get hijacked to do these things. And then you like, oh, like this person's blacklisted because their identity was used to do a deep fake, but it was just someone stole their password. So like, I mean, that's an aside thing. I just want to briefly mention that. Like, that's something that really also needs to be seriously addressed. And blockchain can help with that, but it's far from perfect.
So do you know in the United States what every American citizen pretty much just knows as their one secret private thing? The one thing that's like their secret private thing?
Social security number?
That's right, our social security number.
I knew that.
Yeah. Right? We don't even have a government issued central ID. Like, our government just had to say, hey, that's not in the Constitution. So since we made a social security network, let's just go ahead and use that number for everything, right? My country is not particularly good at educating its people to have one master identity that we can always keep secure and private. That's just not existent. And when I look at what I consider to be crucial things like decentralized identity documents, right? That is not an everyman solution right now. No one's going to go and memorize or write down a 256-bit encryption key and try to keep that private from everybody in their desk drawer, right?
Well,
so what are we going to do?
Yeah, I know. I read that in South Korea, apparently, when you get a cell phone, and you guys maybe know this better than me, but this is what I've heard, somewhat anecdotally, but when you get a cell phone in that country, you have to show your ID when you get your phone, and it's actually checked. And it has all kinds of interesting repercussions in that market. Like, for instance, they really know if you're under the age of a certain age on a phone, and so they can control, like, installing certain kinds of apps on your phone in a way that in the U.S. we can't control. That's an example where now, instead of a social security number, they're using like this phone number essentially as a tool for the same kind of de facto solution. So there's all kinds of, and then I think in other countries like Estonia or whatever, they have this sort of digital identity they've created, which I think is very much tied into your biometrics, I believe. I mean, people listening to this will know better than me. But there's all kinds of, you can learn. I think one pitfall I would just say for the U.S. in general is this inability to look outside of its borders, to be like, well, how has this been solved like in other jurisdictions for better or worse? And are there best practices out there?
System, okay?
It is
exactly that kind of, but there's things out there that have been done that are interesting that could maybe point to like a best practice for how to do some of this stuff.
Yeah, America is a hard solution.
Yeah.
And ironically, it is one of the few places where Europe is actually probably ahead of the US. In these types of security.
You have to understand, For Americans, it is not a technological issue. It is a political will issue. We are talking about a country, and I love my country. I really, truly do. That when barcodes came out, UPC barcodes, we had groups of people, generally by faith, saying this is the end times, the book of Revelation,
the
mark of the beast. Yeah, everything. There is literally a popular store today that like sells like garden variety stuff in their store, hobby stuff, and they don't put barcodes on anything. They make the cashiers ring everything up by hand, right? And it's a national chain because of how much random fear there can be in a subsegment of our population about identity. So these are also social problems that have to be solved.
Yeah.
But luckily, those people generally aren't adopting AI first anyway. So to be fair, the people who want to use AI and want to leverage this stuff and protect themselves are the more likely people who will be up for digital solutions.
On an AI-related solution, just something I like to mention occasionally because I think this was a cool, science fiction book idea that, like, from Neil Stephenson in one of the more recent books he wrote. I forget which one it was, but you probably know what I'm talking about, Tim, since you're already laughing.
I love Neil Stephenson.
I think it's called PURDA, P-U-R-D-A-H. The idea was that there's like AI that can like identify you based off of what you do, regardless of like using a different name or kind of acting slightly different or whatever. But it's like this idea that there's a sort of fingerprint to your identity through behavior that's identifiable, regardless of, genetics, regardless of like lots of different factors that are changeable in some way, or not changeable in other ways. And so those ideas of like sort of futuristic where we're using AI or blockchain or these other tech to like do new things with identity, I think are worth exploring those different directions, even though, it was a science fiction idea in a book, but, iPads were in Star Trek first, that's just how it is with this stuff. So,
no. Digital sonography is real and already exists. To the point that if you interact on a major website, there's a JavaScript snippet in there that's watching your mouse movements, anonymizing it, turning it into a set of hashes and saying, hey, look, this dude moves his mouse at this speed in these patterns. His IP is totally different from this one over here, but they're the same person. That does
like
exist.
Handwriting analysis people that are good at like, they can see like you can sign it different every time, but they can recognize it's the same person signing it, which is good because my signature is different every time.
Yep. That's why you run it through an AI first to change all your text. Haha.
Sorry, I have to rein everything in. David, you wanted to say something. I'm going to give you the last word, but as part of that, I'd like you to summarize everything that we discussed in like 2 minutes. So, and that's actually Tim and Devin laugh because they know why I'm asking. One, because we talked about a lot. Like we covered a lot of ground here, and I think it's useful for you just you have this in your head, just lay out the foundation of what the issue we're really talking about, and it's going to be helpful for me as well.
So I'll just, I think, high level summarize that we have an opportunity as a people to, on one hand, change the nature of ownership around AI so that it winds up being more collectively owned for all of our collective efforts in making it happen. And number two, through the use of attribution, essentially cryptographically and all these processes, have a level of accountability as to like when things go bad or when they go well. That's essential actually for AI to become trusted. So those two things, that ability to have collective ownership and that ability to have accountability through essentially signing events, are, I believe, like major unlocks to enhance the stability and value of AI over time. And it's a kind of perfect sandwich between the Web3 tech, the AI tech. You put them together, you're going to get your Web 4, and that's Web 4. It's essentially putting those processes together. So that's the summary in less than 2 minutes.
Fantastic. Web 4, that might be a good thumbnail one. Although I've seen a bunch of games that were saying like, oh, Web 2 plus Web 3 equals Web 5. And so they were building a Web 5 game. And that just made me cringe my ass off and insta-pass on that pitch deck.
That's new math. We don't do new math here.
Exactly. I just couldn't handle that anymore. Anyway, good. This was fantastic. What we're going to do is we're going to, when we put down the the phone on this recording, discuss or find a new moments to, I would say, continue this conversation. One thing I want to dig into then is going to be how gaming ties into this, because I really liked what you mentioned earlier. I believe it was you, David, that said that gaming historically has been a sort of playground, and it's easier to mess around and make a mistake in a game than it is in something like a financial primitive like DeFi, which is also something where you could potentially, start experimenting here. So that is a discussion for later. With this, Devin, Tim, and especially star of the show, David, thank you so much for joining. This was really enlightening. I think in digesting this, we'll get some more questions, maybe some insights. Listener, we hope you did as well. We hope you enjoyed. And with that, stay tuned for the next episode, and we will speak with you then. Ciao.
Thank you all.
Ciao.
Great to be here. Appreciate it.